Welcome to Annotations to Art, Politics and Life Itself. My name is Nico Heller. My guest today is Lou Mo. Lou is a Taipei-based artist and curator specializing in contemporary Asian and African art, with a BA in art history from McGill University and further studies in Chinese art from the School of Advanced Studies in Social Sciences in Paris. In 2022, she was selected as one of 4 guest curators of the 14th Dakar Bienniale in Senegal, and in 2023-24, she curated Hot Flux, modern and contemporary photography in Taiwan and Africa at the Tainan Art Museum. As a member of the School of Mutants collective, her works have been exhibited at prestigious venues such as the Taipei Fine Arts Museum, Centre Pompidou Metz, the 12th Berlin Bienniale, autostrada Biennale, and the Glasgow International, whilst her research-based works have been featured at the Hong-Gah Museum, the Cube Space in Taipei, and the Kochi Bienniale in India. And I can see that Lou has arrived, so do let me invite her in. Lou, good morning.
Good morning, Nico. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you very much for joining me this morning for our Annotations dialogue. Lou, I believe you joined me from London. Is that correct?
That is right. So I am currently traveling and in London, of course, not complaining about it. Back after 5 years, because last time I was a little bit before COVID. So happy to be in town and seeing friends and shows.
That's beautiful. That's amazing. Just on the face of it, do you notice many changes? Has London changed a lot, or is it still the old London?
Um, I think also this time because the experience is coming down from a recent exhibition opening in Glasgow. And the screening, of course, also on the topic we're going to discuss about today, Afro-Asianism. I think I do notice in the contemporary art exhibitions that, of course, the level of shows are quite good compared even to a lot of European cities. And I think also there is a real effort in being more culturally diverse.
Absolutely, absolutely. I spent, a big part of my life in London. I love the city, and I'm so jealous that I'm not there myself. Lou, let's kind of dig straight in. I'm so glad to have you here. So let's make good use of the time we have. As a female Chinese Canadian curator and artist based in Taiwan, of all places, how do you approach the curation and presentation of African and Asian art through a decolonial lens?
Mm. Um, I would say, of course, that throughout my practice, that's what I try to do, and from a post-colonial, decolonial angle. And I present both African and or Asian artists. And for the last few years, I've been trying to present them in dialogue to each other, both as a research approach, I suppose, and also from a methodological point of view, to put them into dialogue with each other versus how they could usually be presented. And how does my being female and a Chinese Canadian play into that? I suppose we've, in our previous conversations, touched a little bit onto it. So, of course, my academic training and first professional experiences are in Asian art, more specifically Chinese art, both classic and contemporary. And my coming from, I suppose, a Chinese immigrant background, perhaps that gives me some legitimacy to talk about it. And then, of course, as I practiced, developed an interest in the African context, particularly contemporary art, where I've also worked with a number of artists and on different shows. And I think the main difference of how I worked with that second large category is precisely because I don't come from that cultural background. So I'm able I hope to look at it with a fresh set of eyes in order to present them together. And in the particular context of Taiwan, I think I really went in sort of with some naivete because I'm not from there. And so we stayed for some time for COVID. And I think instead of being quite familiar with the local art scene, I wanted to do something that is of interest to me. And because, of course, I would never know as well or has much experience working with the Taiwanese artists than the local curators already do. And so it is, I think, really just with this kind of motivation going straight forward that I tried to do a few projects.
Absolutely. I mean, it's interesting because, of course, the arts and the art world are very heavily framed in a European or in a sort of a Western context. This is partly to do with the way art history has been taught, but and of course, over the centuries, especially, the 20th century and so on, we have developed a kind of a specialist language, if you like, as of art speak. And that art speak, that language frames how we think, how we see stuff. And in my world, and it is indeed a European world, it's very much framed in that tradition. Indeed, it's quite interesting is you have in Europe, and you may well have that in Asia and in North America as well, this distinction between outsider art and kind of like fine art, high art, or whatever you want to call it. And the fundamental distinction is that outsider art tends to be produced or created by artists that haven't gone through the academy system. In other words, they're kind of untrained artists. And it's quite interesting because they are obviously, many of them are hugely talented. And of course, they're not untrained at all. It's just that they're not trained in a particular tradition. And you can actually spot it a mile off. And this is not about your judgment. It just suggests that our academy system produces a particular aesthetic, a particular way of doing things that are quite particular. And even within Europe, if you don't go through that academy system, it shows. And I think it shows in very positive ways, but whatever way you look at it, it shows. Now, of course, looking at this from a sort of an Asian or a perspective, or from an African perspective, clearly that must really jump out too. So what are the kind of the key considerations and challenges you face in kind of developing a kind of a decolonial approach?
Yes, I think, of course, the way art historical knowledge or exhibition is created is intrinsically connected to our knowledge, and hence the importance, I think, both for artists, and outside of it, the importance of, decolonizing the academy, or you might say indigenizing the academy, which also came up in a recent interview I did with a Taiwanese indigenous scholar, which was very inspiring. I think of course, let's perhaps focus on the Asian context where I've been based for the last few years, and touching a little bit on the African context. So I think in the Asian, particularly East Asian institutional and academic landscape, it's still very much of the academy and canon kind of perspective if we come from a art historical or fine arts training. Of course, throughout the long history of East Asia, particularly in the greater sort of Sinosphere, you do have an alternative tradition of the Chinese classical tradition, which is also very prominent. However, it remains an upper class and educated discipline, and which forms its own scholars and so on. And the institutions, so mostly, I suppose, the contemporary arts institutions in East Asia, let's say, are middle-aged. For example, in the case of Taiwan, the older, more contemporary-oriented museums are, let's say, about 40 years old, and more or less the same if you look at museums in maybe Korea and Japan. In China, it's linked with the boom in Chinese contemporary art, so a little bit younger. And, there's also a lot of private museums and so on. So there's been also a tendency to do the white box shows and to present what we know, essentially, because that is what we know and we're comfortable presenting. But I think in the last some years, there's also been quite a trend to present more grassroots initiatives and artists that might be called, let's say, quote unquote, outsider. And I think this sort of more theoretical, sociological, and turn is quite general, but from the perspective of East Asian institutions linked with our history to colonization, to the lack of understanding about racism and geopolitics, it's more at this point oriented towards Southeast Asia, where there is a Chinese diaspora present. And of course, because it is closer to home, closer to a context and the history we understand. And that, of course, also writes into the ways bilateral exchanges are organized, funding is organized, and so on. And I think in terms of the African landscape, we're definitely talking at a moment, at a very exciting moment, because there are a lot of things happening. There are some older established contemporary art events on the continent, such as the Dakar Bienniale, which I've been fortunate to be a part with for the last edition. But you see more and more new initiatives in terms of art centers, spaces that are quite community and grassroots oriented, and artist residencies. Very often also associated with the studio and practice of a more established artist that wants to do something for the community. And of course, fortunately or unfortunately, we start really in the last few years to note about it also in the international art market. But I think, you can notice there is quite a different tone from the onset. And for me, I've been trying to practice between these scenes. Of course, it is difficult because the other we've always been knowing is the Western tradition, and how to convince an institution to present something they're not familiar with. And in different contexts, there's also different cultural concerns and trends that we are working on right now. So I think all of this is more of a larger background. But of course, going into the more practical considerations, there's I think these are the difficulties that all curators might encounter once you finally, maybe after a couple of years, to manage to convince your museum curator, for example, to put African photographies in a Taiwanese museum. How do you go about? Because oftentimes there is not a lot of budget, and also out of practical considerations, it is often quite difficult for artists between these two regions to have exhibition or residency opportunities in between, due to the lack of funding, or due to directions in funding policy, or just the lack of space, or the impossibility of travel due to visas and all of these things, which is also one of the things that I think really struck me in experience earlier this month, because beginning of June, I was mentoring for artist residency in Gabon, in Libreville. And so it's a first contemporary artist residency organized with the help of the French embassy there. And so artists come from different backgrounds, the ages and experiences are quite varied. And the first thing you notice is, of course, that there is no public funding funding going to the contemporary arts in the country, nor is there artistic training, education in Gabon. So that's still to go. There is at this point one museum, which is quite history and ethnographic focused. And also for these artists, even traveling to Europe, sort of back to the metropolis is already difficult. And how do you go from there to try to find an exchange program to Asia if they're interested? And some of them were. So I think it's, it's something we're still working on.
Absolutely. I mean, I think at this point, it's really worth sort of to make a distinction between the making of art and its curation.
Yeah.
Because, of course, when we think about art, we tend to think about the artwork, and sort of implied in that, the making of it. Now, there is, like, in terms of artistic practice, there's a whole host of there's traditions to this, yeah, and they are indeed in Europe quite deep, just as they are quite deep anywhere in the world, in fact. But the European tradition, in terms of the canon, you can go back and back and back. But that's quite different from the curation of art, because you, as a museum professional, know this very well. Really, public museums and galleries are actually a fairly new thing, even in Europe, never mind the US. So, we're talking 19th century here, essentially, the birth of the museum. Before that, we had private collections. And yes, people would look at it, but not the general public. And indeed, its purpose, the purpose of private collections, was to this day, is very different from the purpose of a public collection or indeed a public exhibition. Now, as a curator, you are not so much concerned in that role with private collections, only to the extent that you may want to borrow some of the works for an exhibition. You are concerned about, if you like, pedagogical and sort of concepts and strategies for actually kind of bringing that work to a wider public and to frame it in such a way that it is read in a way that is sympathetic to your own way of looking at it. So the curatorial perspective is in a way very different, if you like, from the artist's perspective. And I think it's quite important to make that distinction because, frankly, the African artists, the Asian artists, I know, they don't need decolonizing. I mean, it's quite patronizing to say, hey, we better decolonize you, or you better decolonize. No,
but they're not the ones who are trying to decolonize.
Right. So that's right. So exactly. So this isn't about decolonizing artists or artistic practice. There is actually a great degree of emancipation. There is a rising self-confidence, I notice, which is actually quite fresh, globally, in Africa, in Asia, in South Latin America, you name it. And there's a kind of an uprising of artists who believe in their own sort of rootedness in their own culture and traditions. So we're not focusing on this. We're not talking about decolonizing artists. We're talking essentially, I mean, to bring it down to a point, decolonizing structures and institutions. I mean, really, because that is where art is framed. And saying this, of course, as I said, in Europe, this has been a modernist project. In the pre-modern time in Europe, there was no public art gallery to speak of. And there wasn't an art world in that sense, not a democratized art world as we have it today to speak of. So we're talking about a modern movement in Europe, and we're talking about the same thing around the world. So to suggest that modernism is essentially just a European thing, well, yeah, it kind of industrialization did start in England, they say, but of course it wasn't about English traditions and culture. It was about something very new. It was a break with the past rather than a kind of a logical kind of next step. So it was a revolution. It was the Industrial Revolution, and it was modernism, and so on and so forth. So we're talking about decolonizing institutions. And from a curator's perspective, that means, as I understand it, to some extent, creating a space that allows you to center non-European artistic approaches and perspectives, rather than just relating them primarily to Western conventions. Now, can you give me an example of how you do this in your work?
Yeah, no, I think, of course, it's always a process of negotiation. I think you never, especially in institutions, never has, first of all, as much budget as you would like. And second of all, it's also about negotiating with the institution, because I think even though sometimes in exhibitions you may present only African and or Asian artists, but the museum setting itself is very classic. It has an understanding that's rooted in artistic and art historical tradition of what an exhibition needs to be. So it's something I think to negotiate with and not necessarily against. And of course, because the museum usually has been around for a bit longer, it is known to the community, appreciated by the artistic community. So usually I don't really see necessarily the point of really going against it. And you are also in the context of each exhibition, trying to present some content that you think can be interesting or inspiring for the people that usually go in there. And I think also just to clarify, because I'm sure we've all seen a lot of different types of exhibitions. There are exhibitions for the public and artists for artists. And I try to tend to lean towards the first option. And also I'm actually quite comfortable, happy to do research is, I think something I do well, and also happy to sort of like create this I suppose you would call more pedagogical context in an exhibition, particularly when you are presenting artists to an audience that is very far from their history and background. I think you can appreciate, of course, the artworks for their sakes, but you always have audience coming in that are interested to know a bit more about the background. So that is a part of the work that needs to be done. And then from there, it's really a process of understanding. So I'm in this particular venue. These are this is the demographics. These are the people coming in. If we put the effort into making this show, why is it they should be interested in seeing it? And I think one of the recent examples I can give you is the photo exhibition I curated that finished in April of this year. So it's an idea I had fairly quickly after I came to Taiwan, which was already 5 years ago. So that passed quickly. And so I've always been very interested in modern and contemporary African photography. And and in the last decade or 2 decades, it's also been, I think, both in Africa and in the European context, more exhibited than before, more researched, and so on. Whereas in the Asian context, even the quite well-known artists, like Seydou Keita, Malik Sidibé, etc., they were not really exhibited or known. So of course, I mean, that's a very simple starting point, thinking, they're great artists. I think for a museum going public, they would be interested in seeing that. And that also coincides with my noticing that photography as a topic, as a category to be exhibited in art museums, is also in the particular local Taiwanese context sort of on the rise. You hear more talks from scholars, and the photo center opened in Taiwan during my time there. And so there's more of an understanding of the history of photography and how it fits in the landscape. And the publication of Singaporean scholar John Wu Bing's Photography in Southeast Asia, which I recommend for you to read because it is an very interesting book, and it covers a lot of ground. So I think, now is a good time that we talk about it. And because, of course, a lot of Taiwanese photographers are also going into museum collections. So that is the making of Hot Flux, modern contemporary Taiwanese and African photography at the Tainan Art Museum, which is a few years in the making because of the difficulties of COVID. So, the schedulings changed as the museum closed and reopened and so on to make it finally happen. And, I think narrowing down the topic on the Asian part from the Asian to the Taiwanese is also a practical consideration, both as to how to speak to the local public, but also in terms of, working with the museum's collections in the availability of what we can more easily have on loan to exhibit. I think it is not in my opinion, theoretically, almost never though, a 10 on 10 exhibition, but I was quite happy to be able to put it in the exhibition in the museum as a first sort of major photo exhibition, also featuring African modern and contemporary artists in an Asian institution, and with the more introductory approach to be quite general, hoping it also would spark an interest for more conversations to go.
Now, obviously, and you know this extremely well, no space is value free. I mean, a space always radiates a particular value. It might be power, it might be prestige, it might be establishment, whatever. It might have, spaces are red, and they also act almost like filters. So, a certain space only certain people will enter voluntarily. Other people will be repelled, or they'll be fearful of entering it, or they might feel embarrassed or whatever. So, and of course, or they may not even consider it their space, they may just ignore it. Tons of reasons why people don't go and why other people do go. And as you said earlier, art does have a sort of a middle class, upper middle class kind of framing. So it tends to attract a certain audience. Now, of course, part of, and this goes in Europe goes back a long way, part of the reason, the motivation behind establishing public museums was to give the public, it was actually about public education. It wasn't just about doing something that's interesting, but it was very much actually also about keeping the men out of the bar, the pub, stop them drinking and do something else, something more meaningful. It was also about, there was like many museums had, say, gallery spaces where you could look down on other people's looking at exhibits. So it was very much about holding up a mirror and sort of saying, this is what you look like. This is what our people look like. So a space is all about encounters as well. And it's not just about the art. And of course, it is also about the art, and the art will have a big bearing on how people engage and encounter that space. And of course, over this, the last 150 years, museums have developed quite refined strategies of outreach, of bringing different groups in, from students and pupils, from school children, from, the disadvantaged communities, minorities, and so on and so forth. Now, it's within those programs, within those strategies, that I think there's a lot of scope for decolonization, because the question is, who owns the space and who is it for? Now, in terms of creating a space that centers non-European artistic approaches and perspectives, I think this is quite a kind of a potent idea, to create a space where people do not sort of reference, their lives against Europe, but against something that is very indigenous. And you said it earlier, sort of indigitizing. I don't know, was that the word you used?
Indigenizing,
I think. How do you do that? I think that's a really interesting concept. And how do you do that with the space, say, in Asia or in Africa?
Yeah, no, I think, of course, first of all, it is the research and the content that you put on. And, even amongst Asian and African artists, they come from very different educational and social backgrounds, and their practices are very different. So it's also about, what you think are, the values you think are important to represent in this kind of context. But I think whether it is indigenizing the museum or the academy, I think it is equally important. And now with a younger generation of museum programmers and educators, and even just educators, because we also do have a lot of friends who are school teachers, I think it's looking up. So that is, definitely on the change as, the generation shifts as well. I think, of course, it has to start with understanding, having the literacy to understand these concepts. But I think there's definitely been a lot of effort on museums internationally. And of course, unfortunately, I do not have a solution as, to the internal museum problem of how to attract everyone, how to have more quote clients, because the number of visits is always something your museum director would look at. But I think, I think there is some effort, and I think as an artist and curator, whether I'm presenting my own work or a curated show, what you can do, what I try to do is to really do the research and make myself available to put the content that is available to them, and to also explain that the space I'm trying to create in the exhibition is already an effort to try to look away, because I think more fundamentally in the strategy that you don't, that when you compare and contrast, because usually there is always the specter of the Western tradition, that you are looking against a Western canon or a chronology, but if if when we're curating, we're already looking at when you're not compared to the other, because usually it is the Asian and the Western, or the African and the Western. But in the last few shows I've curated, I've tried to put together the African and the Asian as a reference to each other. So I think that's you're already trying to create some space for, at least for conversations there.
Absolutely. I mean, if you go to Tate Modern on Bankside, the power station, what you'll find is on each floor there. I believe it's on each floor, but it's been a while that I've been there. But certainly on one or two floors, they have this timeline, a sort of like basically where they kind of give the entire sort of, like, I don't know where it starts, but probably somewhere like in the 15th, 14th century. I don't know, but it goes all the way up, and it gets more dense as we get, because it's obviously modern art. And right up to the present day. And if, as a visitor, you enter this space and you get the canon, European canon, thrown at you right there, right in your face, and you kind of think, "Oh wow, aren't we cultured? Aren't we? This is our tradition." And it's well-known names. It's the artists we know. The Picassos, you name it. How far away are we in Asia and in Africa from having something similar, so that when, like, say, in Taiwan, somebody goes to a museum, they see the history of Asian or even Taiwanese art on the wall?
I think we are still a long way to go, fortunately and unfortunately. So there's still work for us to do. Of course, I mean, the chronology and the canon, first of all, is in the head of the people who work in these institutions. And that's something I don't think we can ever get rid of, unfortunately. But also, particularly in the East Asian context, I think you also have the similar idea of a canon and of a chronology, but very differently. Because, for instance, I trained as a scholar of classical Chinese art, Chinese paintings and calligraphy. And when you talk about later Chinese art, it's from the 10th century. So anything that is less than 1,000 years old for a Chinese art historian is fairly recent. So I guess to some extent you already have that idea of a comparison to something else. But I think more and more I tend to, at least in my own practice, to use these tools, to create maps, create chronologies, but to let go of sort of the more scholastic references. I think they will always be there, but it's also about trying to put something else on, in writing or something, as you can see. Because I think throughout my own practice, both as artist and curator, I'm trying also to understand and to focus a bit more in the last few years about knowledge production and what are some of the paradigms of understanding what is knowledge. For instance, as you mentioned, I think it is always difficult. I don't know as much as I should, but I think and I hope there is this effort that is going somewhere, it's really been a focus since the last couple of years, and I'm also very inspired by indigenous critical theories of different understandings of how of what knowledge is, how it is created, and how it can be kept. So it really starts in our head.
Absolutely. But it's interesting. It's when you're trying to shift the conversation
mm,
from, a sort of, if you like, a European perspective to an indigenous or decentralized perspective. It doesn't sort of a peripheral perspective, a perspective that doesn't always refer back to Europe as a sort of the center of the world, but that can have a direct reference, say,
mm,
to African art or to South Latin American art. In other words, a kind of a far more sort of a global perspective rather than a purely
mhm,
European-centric
mm,
perspective. When you try to shift the conversation in this kind of way, there is it's actually quite a difficult thing to do, and we all begin to sort of like work with sort of rhetorical strategies and all kinds to
mm,
try to kind of shift that. And there's a real danger
mm,
that in trying to represent the diverse cultural perspectives, that we begin to sort of essentialize. Like, this is African art, this is whatever, the kind of, and we all know this, the boxing, the kind
mm,
of, and and indeed, African artists suffer from that, because when they do stuff, how often are they told, but that's not really African, is it? I mean, in fact, it happens now, thankfully, in Europe as well. People have been accused of appropriation, so it's beginning to kind of, an awareness
mm,
begins to emerge. But there is a danger that we kind of sort of oversimplify, or that we sort of essentialize in an attempt to kind of shift the conversation. How do you navigate these complexities, and how do you avoid that?
mm. I think, of course, that is always the danger from the beginning, because when you start to see um, works from artists from other regions in the European museological context, we can always cite Les Magiciens de la Terre, but at the Centre Pompidou. But of course, in a show such as this, and it is also quite often criticized that there is a very intentional selection of artists from regions that are not Western, from a non-academic, fine arts training background, whereas this time you already have, for example, African artists who's had a professional and or artistic training. Um, I I think also for me personally, it's just a bit funny to think about how we started, because you had to introduce me. So I'm a woman, I'm Chinese Canadian, and I live in Taiwan. Usually we don't like to label people, but sometimes it's also important where we come from. So for instance, people would tend to think, I suppose, in the beginning, quite natural if I told them that I'm an art historian of Asian art. But when I started working in African context, then especially with the way I think independent curatorial practice can be understood, then there's often the question, if you're not the older white man specialist who's been doing it for years, or the young African curator on the rise, so who are you? What are you doing there? So I think it's also the importance of having other perspectives. And also my coming not from, I suppose, a curatorial studies background. So I come from a background in research, in the humanities. And I think at heart, my practice remains the practice of a researcher. So each time you go into an artist studio, you work with them, it is also about understanding where this work is coming from, where what it is talking about. Because I think we've all had the experience, sometimes more intensely, when you go into a lot of exhibitions, you see a lot of works, and at some point, it's not worth taking notes, because the really good artworks that are sincere, that are very powerful, in the way it is told, in the way it speaks to you, well stay. You don't have to remember it. If you visited something and 3 days later you really have no idea what you've seen, then probably for you it didn't stick for a reason. So I think there's that. It's about the always knowing what it's about. It's the research. It's the personal contact. And also, it's also one of the questions I've been pondering on. I think for a lot of artists too, it's not necessarily just a pitfall in curatorial research. So for instance, in the Taiwanese context, in the last couple of years, I've started also working with some indigenous artists. And you know as well as I that, you know, in the Asia Pacific, there's been a curatorial trend to acknowledge this indigenous past, the Pacific or the Austronesian cultures, and sometimes, you know, for cultural funding purposes, let's be honest, for political correctness. And so it does, I think it's also something for the artist to think about, because, you know, when you ask an indigenous or an African artist, like, you know, if you're an indigenous artist, do you have to be an indigenous person to speak about, you know, indigenous history? And you know, if you're an indigenous artist, whatever you create isn't necessarily, you know, about indigeneity. So I think it's an ongoing, it's an ongoing sort of like bilateral conversation. And when you, so usually the curator is the person who chooses what to put in the show. So definitely you are in a position, I think, of organization and decision. I don't think my practicing as a younger women independent curator is necessarily in a position of power, unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess. But you know, there's definitely there. So I think there's a lot going into the attention and the care you can put. So you know, for instance, for me, every time you curate an exhibition, it is a huge job. And I don't think I can personally be the kind of super productive curator where you have a show every 2 months. Then I don't think I have, you know, I've spent enough time with these artworks and artists to know what they're really about. So I guess there's no solution or easy way around it, but, you know, you put in the work.
It's interesting. I mean, that you kind of sort of like point this out the way I introduced you, and I think you know, obviously I did this very intentionally because I think it is quite important to be sort of clear about our position in life. I mean, I think in research, I am a great believer in positionality, for example. It's a sort of a feminist idea, and I totally support that. I think if I come from a middle class background, I should be quite careful about talking about how poor people feel or live. If you know, because I'm not poor. You know, if I come from a European perspective, I should not be essentializing African or Asian art because I'm neither African nor Asian. It's a kind of a way of recolonizing, me telling you or some African artist what his art is supposed to look like. So I think it's quite important to sort of be clear where we come from, because only when we have this sort of mutual understanding of who we are can
And
we
what
begin
we
to
do
draw
or do not know.
Yeah, that's right. Can we draw boundaries, but also can we begin to sort of engage in a respectful way? It is from my perspective, it's entirely legitimate for like you know, a Canadian, a Chinese, any Asian or African or European artist to engage or interpret the work or approach of other cultures and other peoples. But it has to be done in a sort of in a, you know, like at a sort of you know, in a way that doesn't impose my own value system on them. At least I have to kind of, in a way, make it very clear, you know, how I do this or why I do this as a form of critique from a European perspective, say. And I think that's entirely legitimate to do, but it has to be done in a quite a transparent way from a clear position that can also then be critiqued by the other party. So this is why I kind of been quite clear. And the other aspect, of course, why I introduced you in this way is because I'm quite fascinated about the breadth of your kind of existence. You know, I mean, there's a mouthful in this, right? The Chinese Canadian female based in Taiwan working with African artists. I mean, how more can you kind of global can you be in your perspective? And that kind of creates a perspective on the world, which I think is quite unique. So it was really more of that than trying to box you or kind of in any way kind of.
No, but I think we know we are always who we are, and you know, you can work with that. Like, you know, for instance, when I work in the Asian context, I mean, of course, it's definitely linguistically and culturally more easy for me to be in certain contexts because I understand the cultural cues, I understand how things work. And for instance, or maybe in the African or indigenous or Caribbean context, then I go in and it's usually quite easy to make clear that, hey, look, I'm here. I'm interested in some of the things. I'm not from here. So I want to see what you think about it, in certain situations. If there are things you think you can tell me, I'm accepted, and so on. And also, you also notice, of course, that my being a woman or Asian, definitely the the interactions can be quite different, and the relation also to racial tensions are different. I think it's not obviously something I ignore, it's something you have to acknowledge and work with. Because
Yeah,
for instance, fortunately at the customs and airports, I'm never perceived as threatening because there's 5'4" of me, so that's it.
Yeah, no, I mean clearly, and there is a sort of there is a sort of a background music. There is a sort of a certainly in I can only here speak for sort of Europe and North America because I don't really know how this plays out. Well, certainly I can say that for India as well, and possibly for places like Brazil, because these places are reported in Europe, but it's just that kind of public perspective I have on those places. But I do see a significant rise in nationalism, a sort of a turning inward, a rise in like in racism, but also in homophobia and other kind of sort of hate perspectives. People are becoming again more insular, kind of withdrawing from the global stage and focusing on their identity. And I think it's within that context that the work of people like you becomes particularly important as points of reference for how to do things differently. So what I'd like to do now is kind of zoom in a little bit, and because you have not only a theoretical perspective on these things, but you've actually worked with African and Asian artists in very practical ways. So could we discuss some of the African and Asian artists whose work you've engaged with, and yeah, well, reflect on how their practices challenge or subvert Western artistic conventions. Because, of course, decolonizing or indigenizing doesn't mean ignoring. It can well mean a kind of a critical engagement with. So, so maybe you can just give us a couple of examples or give us a sense of what that looks like.
Yeah, no, because I knew you were going to ask me probably something about the artist. So perhaps a couple of the ideas that come to mind, I think both in terms of how that practice is can be showed to the public or how it can be organized. Of course, I feel like I've seen a lot of great works in the last few years. So one that really stood out, for instance, I think you might have seen also is Tuan Andrew Nguyen's The Spectres of Ancestors Becoming, that was exhibited at the last Berlin Bienniale in 2022. So I also exhibited as the School of Mutants in that exhibition, and it was also previously premiered just the months before at Raw Material Company in Dakar in Senegal during the biennial. I think Tuan's work is definitely a very powerful example of how certain stories can be told with the involvement of the community that is, representative of their history and respectful of their histories. So in that work, Tuan Andrew studied the what is now the Vietnamese Senegalese diaspora mostly in Dakar in West Africa, that results from the French sending African troops to the Vietnamese War. And I think first of all, in the onset, you already noticed that the very different dynamics, because when you send these African troops over to Vietnam, their sympathies actually were with the Vietnamese, who were not their colonizers and who were as well as family oppressed. And you know, how throughout the long war, certain relationships and families are formed, and you end up with a mixed community that some of them we repatriated to West Africa after the war. So Tuan's spent a few years working with them, reconstructing the histories of these people, these families, and that ended up resulted in a 4-screen film, Breaking the Fourth Wall, with bits that are documentary and bits that are fictive. And it's really sort of like using that very powerful, I think, contemporary multi-channel film medium to present really the history, sort of like the hidden history, the history of everyone, which is not the official discourse of the Vietnam War, but in this very grand in this very grand method. So it's a work that I really loved, and I think everyone should try to see, of, you know, the kind of stories that I suppose I'm also trying to tell in exhibitions. That's one way of it. And I think one thing in particularly, I particularly admire both in Asian and African practices, and I hope there will be room for dialogue in the future, is how a lot of the local and grassroots community-oriented art spaces are organized. And I think there's also going to be more and more of them. So that's something I definitely find interesting. For example, some of them you might have seen in Documenta. So Jati Wangi Cinematheque has an Afro-Asian perspective too. And also I'm thinking about how Waza organizes in Lubumbashi, both as an art space and community center. So these are the practices I think I do find really interesting. And of course, a lot of the contemporary artworks created in recent years are definitely research oriented, and particularly I think of the middle-aged and younger generation of artists. And in these, there's also a lot of great works. Some of these artists, of course, I'm partial because I work with them. But I guess we can go on without it. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I mean, there's sort of two levels to this, isn't it? There's a sort of the level of kind of presenting a kind of, if you like, a distinct perspective, and you know, in this case, instead of a West African perspective, a Senegalese perspective. But there's sort of implicit assumptions and sort of cultural frames that inform that perspective, and these are not necessarily easily accessible to a European or North American or global audience, because they are kind of quite local or certainly regional in scope. So how is a curator? How do you see your role, and where do you see the scope to bridge that, to essentially to foster dialogue and promote understanding between different cultures? I mean, without going back to the sort of essentializing, now we've got the African artist, or, you know, like communicating with the European artist, which funding bodies very often like to see, you know, oh, that's, you know, that's kind of be, but how do you avoid that, and how do you create an authentic dialogue between different cultures?
Yeah, and I suppose it's in the way you present the work, to help the public that comes in wherever you are exhibiting to understand what it is. I'm quite inspired by critical theories and the ways of how you can present works. So of course you have the more classical approach that museums have been using for years. You know, you enter, you know, you have the label, you have the chronology, it tells you where it fits in, and if it doesn't fit in, then that's too bad, and you know, you have to find a way. But I think there are different notions you can approach to as how to enter the work. And first of all, I think many of the really good works that stay with me very often share this very powerful narrative quality. So, you know, first of all, I think from a basic point of view, if it is an installation, if it is a video or something, it is already presented physically in a format that you understand, that you have the cues to read, you know. when you are watching a moving image, there are cues you understand. So I think there is already that. And then, of course, is to as to how what kind of concept you can elaborate on for to help the audience to enter into it. And I'm quite interested in perception. So, for instance, I'm also very often lean on perspectives to explain what is one's positionality, or what are some of the perceptual sort of senses you can use to understand, because sometimes maybe a sound work is as impactful as something that is a full-on installation. So for me personally, I think a strategy I found is to try to let go of a more pedagogical sort of setting. And I think it's something sometimes also the audience, even if you're presenting European artists in a European museum, feels that it's sometimes a bit old-fashioned and maybe a little bit fallen out of use, to make something a bit more creative. And I think usually what sticks is usually an interesting idea or a narrative, so how you can tie these together. But of course, I mean, there are different ways to present an exhibition. And I think usually, at least for me, the scenography is also particularly important. So sometimes you're very lucky with the institution you work with, they have someone that is very good. But I think it's also about the never really let go, I suppose, of the spatial feeling in it when you're working on a show.
It's interesting. I mean, I'm sort of coming to it from a sort of, if you like, and apologies for switching perspectives here for a moment, but I feel I need to bring that in. Sort of looking at it from a sort of an artistic perspective, from a sort of a practitioner's perspective. When I look at work by other artists, I tend to either have a sort of a conceptual reference, or it kind of I see a sort of a certain political alignment or whatever, all that stuff, and yeah, I may or may not agree or whatever, and it may or may not put them in the same camp or the same side as me. But that aside, I find that, of course, that I can do that with kind of like artists whose cultural and political context I fully understand.
But doesn't speak to you.
But when it comes to African artists, I don't have that. So, or when it comes to artists outside that frame, I don't have that. And so what then becomes really important for me are two things. One is that I sort of can connect to something that is intrinsically human, something that transcends.
Yes.
And I think we can, most people are sort of sensitized to looking at art, indeed looking at the world, looking at life and themselves. They have an intrinsic sense of what is real and authentic and what isn't. And we see that in the kind of when we go traveling and we engage with locals, whether they want to sell us something, whether they have an agenda, or whether they are simply just engaging at a very humane level. We all kind of very well know the difference. And we know this, whether it's Europeans traveling to Asia or Africa, or whether it's Africans traveling to Europe. We know the difference so well. And that difference between something real, something humane, something, and something that is curated or something that is kind of put on, is very, 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 very clear. And I think is something that art can do probably much better than many other media. So I would always think that that's one aspect that one would want to curate around. Now, once I have that sort of send of trust, like with the viewer or with the audience, then I can build out from there. And I think the curator has a key role in this, because the references that are then being brought in, I'm kind of inclined to trust, because I have had this direct connection. And of course, the curator then has an intrinsic responsibility to do justice to that nucleus of humanity that is in the work. And so that's kind of my kind of way. And I think, as somebody who has been traveling so widely and been living in so many different cultural contexts as you have a particular sensibility to do exactly that, and and you say you're an artist as well. And not just to approach it from curatorial, from a presentational, perspective, but also from a sort of a much more direct perspective, like to let the art speak for itself. So I think that's really quite a key thing here. Now, one of the kind of the key questions that I have within that context, of course, is how do we then relate that back to some of the big themes, some of the big global challenges we face? You know, like climate change, different wars. Like many actually, we tend to choose in Europe to think only about two wars, yeah, Ukraine and Israel-Palestine, and that's it. We totally forget that there's kind of strife and war and violence going on in so many different parts of the world, which simply aren't covered in our sort of mix of news that we receive every day. So how do we, in a kind of world that's becoming ever more fragmented, ever more sort of localized, but also nationalistic, sort of identity driven, sort of exclusionary, how do we in that world, how can artists use strategies? How do you as a curator work with artists to kind of to bridge that? And how can you go from a sort of a kind of a sense of there's something real in this is something that the work says, and relate that back to some of the main challenges we face?
Yeah, I think I do agree with you that because the curator is not really just the person who comes with a great idea. This is a good topic. We should do something about it. A lot of people can do it. So it's really, I think, as the go between the artwork, the artist, because some artists also, don't tend to talk much about what and how they work, and the museum and the public. And there's definitely, I think that universally, I think, humane quality to a good story you're trying to tell, whether it is in painting, in film, in installation, or something else. And I think it's definitely about kind of, making that quality that connects the artwork and the artist with the public come out. First of all, of course, you have to do your work and try to understand where it is coming from in the context, because I think these are values that can speak to most people, which reminds me, I was also just taking down a brochure because I went to the Delphina Foundation to see Sumia Sankar-Boss's solo exhibition last week. Very beautiful 3-channel film and a VR film, both about the disappearance of his mother as a young child in Bangladesh in the 70s and 80s, and how he ties it to the larger context of independence and unrest at the time. But I think also fundamentally, it is a story of attachment of different family members to each other, to memory, and so on. So I think, once you kind of understand, and if the artist communicates to you successfully, usually it's these emotions that I try to relate together to a certain topic. And of course, again, that is also intrinsically linked to our curatorial knowledge, because you can't understand about everything. There are always only certain items you're working on. But I think it's to also to, I think in the way I sort of collect as for my knowledge works is not particularly related to, oh, I'm interested to independences, I'm interested to wars, but it's more about the feelings these works could evoke.
No, absolutely. Now, we're running out of time, so let me kind of close with just a sort of a question relating to sort of young artists and curators coming up. I mean, you're not exactly old, so don't get me wrong. You're like really, yeah, really, in many ways a young curator yourself, but you have obviously kind of made great inroads, and you are quite established in your field already. And so I do wonder, what kind of advice can you give other curators who may have a kind of a multicultural background like yourself, or are based on the periphery of the art world, as we know it, say in Africa, in Asia, or whatever. What would you say to them?
I think a good and probably a little bit of a detached advice is always stick to the topics you're interested in. I think research is very important. it gives you more perspective, and I think there is also a tendency for a lot of the rising curators to be younger and younger. As for artists, I don't think that is necessarily a good thing. Because when I was 20, I probably didn't have a lot of interesting things to say. There's also, you need time to work to accumulate. And I think usually the really terrible thing is, if you've been propelled into a rapid working pace, that in a few years, if you don't have anything to say, then that is a terrible thing. So I guess me being an independent curator, which is what I do in terms of curation, is never an easy job, but it requires a lot of stamina. So don't give up and keep on doing your research, really.
Absolutely, absolutely. Lou, thank you ever so much. Do you have any shows coming up yourself? Any kind of pitch you would like to make? Anything you'd like us to know about? Now would be the moment to let us know.
Now is the time, or forever hold your peace. So I do have an ongoing show that just opened at the Glasgow International, at the Centre for Contemporary Art in Glasgow, which is a part of the festival as well, curated by amazing Glaswegian curator Thomas Abercrombie of the School of Abolition, and we are the School of Mutants. So whereas you may have seen the School of Mutants exhibitions in Europe, what I would like to do is really to invite you to go to Glasgow, because well, first of all, it is Scotland, so who does not love freedom and whiskey? And also, I'm very impressed at the quality and the artworks I have seen at Glasgow International. I think it does live up to its name of both being very about Glasgow and very international. And there's a true focus also on great artworks by young Glaswegian or Scottish artists of different backgrounds. I think because I've been in a number of biennials in the last few years, and sometimes you feel like you're always traveling with the same people, seeing works that, I mean, at least as a professional, about. But this is an instance of discovery and learning. So I think if you happen to be in the region, it would be a great visit, and it's on until the end of August.
Until the end of August. Perfect. Excellent. So yes, all our English, Scottish, Welsh, and Irish viewers do go to Glasgow. It's a brilliant place. It does have a very good art college as well, of course. It's a lovely city. It's actually my favorite Scottish city. I prefer it to Edinburgh. I find Edinburgh a bit sort of, but yeah, no, brilliant. Thank you very much. I wish you good luck with your show up there as well. And yeah, let's catch up and let's keep that dialogue going. Thank you very much for being my guest today.
Thank you, Nico, very much for the invitation, and talk soon.
Talk soon. Bye bye.